Okay, we'll start the conference right now. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. Welcome to the third conference of the Public Choice Club and the final activity of the rent-seeking month. Lightships and rent-seeking and interventionism. How interest and coercion can stop innovation and even the creation of new markets. Today, I have the honor to introduce our speaker, Rosolino Candela. He is an Associate Director of Academic and Student Programs and a Senior Fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercado Center at George Mason University. Prior to George Mason University, he taught in the Department of Economics at Brown University, where he was also a postdoctoral research associate in the Political Theory Project. He was also a visiting professor of economics at Universidad Francisco Marroquín and a visiting fellow in the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the European University Institute. Thank you, Rosolino. Welcome.
Luis, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. And I want to thank you and Leonel and Rudy for organizing this conference. And again, just to reiterate, thank you all for being here. What I'd like to do today is I want to start by motivating this talk with a particular story. So all of you are very familiar right now with the ongoing battle between holders of taxicab medallions around the world against Uber, where Uber is a technological innovation around the existence of holders of taxicab medallions. Taxicab medallions holders having a government privilege that grants them the right to operate taxis at a higher price than otherwise would exist. And now there's this ongoing battle today because of that, between entrepreneurs circumventing around regulation. What I want to do today is tell you of a similar story that took place in the 18th century, one about the role of lightships, and lightships being the Uber of the 18th century, that is circumventing around government regulation in the operation of lighthouses in the 18th and 19th century. And I point the 18th and 19th century precisely because this is the time in which lighthouses, private lighthouses, were being constructed in England and Wales prior to the entire nationalization of the lighthouse market, beginning in 1836 and ending in 1842, when the last private lighthouse was put into government hands. Now, the way I want to motivate this discussion today is to ask the following puzzle, right? What role does government play in the provision of public goods? Now, I apologize in advance because what I'm going to do is just to ensure that everyone understands the way I'm using the language, I'm going to define them as I go. I apologize for being pedantic, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands the argument that I'm constructing. Now, what I mean by a public good in the technical economic sense is I'm referring to a good that's regarded as non-rivalrous, meaning that two individuals can simultaneously consume the good at the same time, or to put that another way, non-rivalry implies that you can produce additional units of that good at zero marginal cost, right? Imagine a horizontal supply curve for a good. That's what we mean by non-rivalry. But a public good is also non-excludable, meaning that such goods can be provided such that beneficiaries of that good can free ride on the payment of others. So in standard economic theory, the argument that's put forth, that's postulated, is that there's a market failure in the deliverance of public goods. That is due to problems of free riding. Providers of public goods, contributors to public goods, face a concentrated cost, the benefits of which are dispersed and such that other consumers can free ride on the provision of that good, right, without contributing to the production of that good. So the optimal response, the rational response of these individuals, according to standard economic theory, is that such a good will be underprovided. And therefore, the role of government is to step in and intervene in order to provide a public good, either through taxation, through some form of regulation, or direct production by the government itself. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is the example of lighthouses as the textbook example next to national defense, as the quintessential example of a public good that is required for government to provide, right? In many ways, for economists, this is a very American analogy, what I'm going to give, but the role that lighthouses play in public goods theory and the battle that's taken place makes the lighthouse the Vietnam of economics. What I mean by that is, right, economists who argue for free markets and economists who argue for market failure have battled for centuries, literally centuries, over the example of a lighthouse, and whether it's demonstrative of whether it's a public good or a good that can be provided by markets. And the reason why I refer to it as the Vietnam in economics is that economists on both sides would argue that if you can demonstrate that the lighthouse is a public good or not, then you, in effect, expose a flaw in public goods theory. And you expose a flaw in the role that government plays in providing public goods, the extent to which it's necessary or not. Now, what I'm going to be arguing is that lighthouses do not exemplify a case of a market failure. Rather, what they exemplify is a failure of the market to exist due to government failure. In other words, what I'm arguing is that lighthouses, the private production of lighthouses, particularly in Britain, specifically England and Wales, in the 17th, 18th, and the 19th centuries, were not underprovided precisely because there was a problem or there were deficiencies in excluding non-payers. In other words, lighthouses do not exemplify a case of a market failure because it's a public good, because of non-rivalry, or because of non-excludability. Rather, what I'm arguing is that government intervention created the conditions that stifled the possibility for entrepreneurs to discover ways in which to exclude non-payers. In other words, to provide excludability mechanisms in order to privately provide and finance the production of lighthouses. And the specific government failure that I'm attributing to the failure of a private lighthouse market to emerge are monopoly power established through monopoly privileges by the King of England, and specifically rent seeking. So lighthouses don't exemplify a case of a market failure associated with public goods. Rather, what they exemplify is a failure of the market exist precisely because rent seeking by holders of monopoly privileges in the production of lighthouses crowded out the possibility for entrepreneurs to devise excludability mechanisms to establish lighthouses. Now, there's going to be two bases of the argument that I'm going to provide here. One is the arguments provided by James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, both seminal figures, founders of public choice, specifically Virginia political economy. Now, what I'm going to be suggesting is that although there may be a market failure in the provision of public goods, government failure can emerge in the correction of particular market failures by making matters worse, right? So one way to think about this is the following. The theory of market failure postulates that compared to the ideal of perfect competition, a complete market with complete information, that when we look in the outside world, real world markets are imperfect, implying they're flawed, or they're suboptimal, or they're inefficient. Rather, what I want to argue is that if we just look at the word imperfect, think about the word imperfect, and trace it back to its roots in Latin, its etymology. If we divide up the word imperfect, the part im is the negation, not. Per refers to the Latin word thoroughly or thorough, and fect comes from the verb facere, to do. So another way to reframe our understanding of a market that's imperfect is simply that that market is incomplete. It's in a process towards completion. So from a public choice analysis, the question is not one of how does government intervention correct a market failure? Rather, if imperfections in the marketplace represent profit opportunities for entrepreneurs to correct market failures, the question then becomes, what's crowding out entrepreneurs from correcting those possibilities? That brings us to the second prong of my argument, which is the Austrian case of markets as processes of entrepreneurial discovery. Now, the Austrian account of the market as a process of entrepreneurial discovery implies that different sets of institutional arrangements will create knowledge to entrepreneurs, right, and present profit opportunities for entrepreneurs to seize in order to create an equilibrating tendency in the marketplace. But what's more important from the Austrian account of the market process is that different sets of institutional arrangements are going to promote different sets of learning. So the Austrian account of the market process of entrepreneurial discovery is one in which a market that's in disequilibrium presents profit opportunities for entrepreneurs to seize in order to correct inefficiencies in the marketplace. What the Austrian account of the market process also implies is that interventions into the market process are going to create unintended consequences that are undesirable according to the standpoint, according to the objectives of a policymaker, right? And those unintended consequences present profit opportunities for entrepreneurs that the government policymakers could not anticipate, right? So let's think about this in one particular example, right? Banking regulation in the United States, right? One of the reasons, for example, for the financial crisis in the United States was precisely because the central bank set interest rates too low for too long. But also, more importantly, the banking system in the US is relatively fragile in the sense that in the past, banks were not allowed to branch outside of their states. That created, right, the instability of that introduced another regulation, which is government-sponsored organizations, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to create a nationalized housing market, right? But that regulation itself, the prevention of banks from branching it outside their state, created entrepreneurial profit opportunity that the regulators could not anticipate. automatic teller machines or ATMs in order to circumvent the regulation, right? So the point I'm trying to illustrate is that the Austrian account of the dynamics of interventionism is going to imply that when regulators intervene in the market process, they're going to introduce profit opportunities that they regard as unintended and undesirable. Faced with that situation, they can make two decisions. Either they can remove the existing regulation, or they can introduce a new regulation in order to mitigate and eliminate the unintended consequence of the initial regulation that they implemented. But what I'm going to illustrate is that the dynamics of interventionism in England and Wales led to a situation where the entire lighthouse market was inevitably nationalized, taken out of private hands. Now, the reason for this, if you look at the history of the operation of lighthouses in Britain at the time, was precisely, this was an 1834 commission report published by English Parliament. And what they had argued was that the entire lighthouse market needed to be nationalized because fees charged by owners of lighthouses were too high. And by nationalizing the market, they can set the price too low. However, a high price in the Austrian account of the market process, a high price for a good presents a profit opportunity for entrepreneurs to enter that market and bid the price back down. The question is, what were the dynamics of interventionism that prevented a private solution to this problem, to this inefficiency in the marketplace? Why were entrepreneurs barred from entering the lighthouse market and make lighthouse services even cheaper? Now, as I said, this is a controversy that is not new. It's as old as going back to John Stuart Mill, who wrote in his classic text, The Principles of Political Economy. And what he argued there, as you can see from this quote, is that because there's a free rider problem in the provision of lighthouses, this required government intervention, government force, coercion, in order to force individuals who are providing lighthouses to be charged a toll, to be charged a fee. And without this compulsory levy imposed by the state, there would be free riding and an undersupply of lighthouses. Now, why is this the case? Right? Imagine if you are a ship owner. The argument goes is that when a lighthouse emits light out into the sea, you can pass the lighthouse in the middle of the night, right? Who's going to stop you and charge you if you're passing in the middle of the night, right? That light that's emitted can be consumed simultaneously by multiple ships, right? It's in this sense that the light emitted from lighthouses is regarded as non-rivalrous. Multiple ships can consume it at the same time. But more importantly, if ships are passing in the middle of the night, there are high costs. There are high transaction costs in enforcing payment and financing for these lighthouses. So Mill argued we need government intervention in order to make a levy or a light due. A light due is the term that's used for fees charged to light ship owners using lighthouse services. We need to force individuals to pay these through a compulsory levy. Now, what Mill meant was not a compulsory levy in the sense that for example, there would be a tax charged for the public production of lighthouse services. What he was arguing is that if lighthouses were privately provided, privately established, there had to be a role for government in ensuring that individuals pay when they use a lighthouse. Now, John Stuart Mill was not the only economist to argue this, right? Other economists, such as Henry Sedgwick, and also who I'm going to refer to here, Paul Samuelson, also argued that government intervention was necessary for the provision of lighthouses because lighthouses exemplify a public good. Now, the first instance in which Paul Samuelson utilized lighthouses as a public good was in his 5th edition of his famous textbook, Principles of Economics, or just Economics, I should say, which was published in 1961. And what's interesting is that he has used that as an example of a public good all the way until the last edition, co-published with William Nordhaus in 2009. But what made Samuelson's argument even different is that not only does the provision of lighthouses require compulsory financing, it also requires public production through direct taxation. Now, what was his argument? Well, if a good is non-rivalrous, implying that you could add additional consumers at zero cost, charging a positive price, right? Charging a money price will imply that that good will be underconsumed compared to the optimal amount of consumption. So his argument was, we shouldn't charge a toll. Lighthouses should be financed through direct taxation, because a toll will create an additional inefficiency. Because if the good is already non-rivalrous, charging a direct toll will imply that less consumers will utilize lighthouses than is optimal, creating an additional inefficiency. Now, Ronald Coase, right, who's one of my favorite economists, right? I like to refer to him as the Snowden of economics. He was the ultimate whistleblower by calling economists on their BS, especially Samuelson, right? Now, what Ronald Coase said was, well, let's actually look at the way the private I'm giving it away. Let's look at the way lighthouses actually operated in real-world markets, rather than inferring through models, through economic theory, that this is impossible through private production and private financing. And that's exactly what he did. In a 1974 article published in the Journal of Law and Economics called The Lighthouse in Economics, what Coase illustrated is that up until the 19th century, lighthouses were privately provided. They were privately produced and privately financed. The way that lighthouses were established, as he argued, is that a group of individuals demanding a lighthouse would petition a particular entrepreneur. And in that petition, in effect, established a contract that those individuals would pay the entrepreneur for the provision of lighthouses. Okay. Now, what's interesting, if you read Coase's article closely, he notes two things, right? He notes two things which make the private provision of lighthouses a deviation from a complete free market in the provision of lighthouses. Right? So Coase did not object to government enforcement in property rights of lighthouses, including financing. But one other exception he notes is that the way in which lighthouses were provided is that pricing was fixed by the king, by the government of England. In other words, these were not free market prices. Now, Coase admitted this exception, and yet there are two economists, well, one legal historian and an economist, one named David Van Zandt and another named Elodie Bertrand, who in more recent years have critiqued Coase's argument. And they claim that what Coase argued was not demonstrative of the private production of lighthouses, that indeed government intervention was necessary for the provision of public goods due to free riding. So what they argue, as Coase was arguing, that lighthouses are not exemplary, are not an example of a club good, a good that's non-rivalrous and excludable, but in fact is a public good. And they note two reasons why this is the case. One is that private lighthouse owners, and they use in quotation private lighthouse owners, alleged private lighthouse owners, before establishing a lighthouse, required government permission in the form of what were called letters patent. Letters patent. And these letters patent, as they argue, granted them a monopoly privilege in establishing a lighthouse in a particular area in exchange for a rent. By rent, I mean a payment above opportunity cost. In exchange for the profits, a share of the profits paid to the king. So what they argue, both Van Zandt and Bertrand, is that what Coase regarded as a private market was in fact demonstrative of market failure, associated with the fact that the patent itself provided government enforcement in the collection of light dues, the fees charged to ship owners. Secondly, that it created monopoly power, that prices charged to lighthouse owners were higher than they otherwise would be in the absence of these letters patent. This is very, as I had introduced the conversation that we're talking about today, this is why I've drawn the analogy between taxicab medallions and lighthouse owners. Right? So in effect, the letters patent is very similar to the medallion that owners of taxicab medallions are provided. So they're arguing this is not a private market. Right? Now, the ultimate question is, how is it that we arrived at a situation in which these medallions were provided in the first place? What was the source of the medallions? Right? That question they leave unanswered. And the reason why I raise that question is also because if the medallions were provided because government intervention was necessary to prevent free riding, then indeed the case of the lighthouse is a public good requiring government intervention, its provision. But what I want to argue is that the letters patent, right, these medallions provided to the lighthouse owners were in fact a response by government authorities to mitigate an unintended consequence of a previous regulation. How did this happen? In order to understand this, we have to begin our story in 1514. Now, in 1514, a seamen's guild, right? A guild, right? Think of this as a union, right? A voluntary union, you might say, right? A mutual aid society called Trinity House, right? Chartered Henry VIII for the regulation of pilotage on the Thames River, right? The Thames River where London flows. Now, Trinity House, as Coase argued, is a private organization, right, with public duties. That is, Trinity House, which exists today in Britain, is a non-profit private organization with a government mandate, right, for establishing and maintaining sea marks. That is safety, maritime safety, not only on the Thames River, but throughout England and Wales. Now, here's what's interesting. Originally, Trinity House was simply a guild that provided mutual aid to mariners, right, in the form of charity to widowers of mariners, those that had been injured or had died, or providing aid to orphans of seamen, right, of mariners. So in effect, it was, you could think of this, of Trinity House, as providing a private social safety net for seamen, for mariners at this time. Now, in the early 16th century, Henry VIII was at war with France. And because of this, there was a shortage of mariners to protect the Thames River, right? Because this manpower was demanded for the British Royal Navy during time of war. Now, what Trinity House did was to rent-seek Henry VIII for a charter to regulate pilotage on the Thames River. Now, pilotage sounds very much like what the word means. Imagine the pilot of an airplane. Pilotage at the time referred to the practice of mariners guiding merchant ships, merchant vessels, safely to port, right? So what the mariners of Trinity House, individuals a part of Trinity House, did was, for example, Luis, you are a merchant vessel. You would pay someone from Trinity House a fee in order to help you navigate the Thames River. The Thames River being a treacherous body of water, right? At times of, right, specifically during times of bad weather, right, there's risk of shipwreck near the rocks and shoals, right, where the Thames River could be shallow. But given that mariners of Trinity House had particularized knowledge of the Thames River, they provided a service that allowed ships to navigate safely on the Thames River. Now, what's interesting, if you look at the charter that was granted to Trinity House for a monopoly on regulating pilotage, it was granted in the name of providing a public good, specifically national defense. So Trinity House argued, look, during this time of war, there may be spies that might flow up the Thames River, or there may be foreign invasion from the French. Right? So in order to eliminate spies or this potential for foreign invasion, we will regulate pilotage throughout the Thames River, right? Now, why is this important, right? Why is this important? Precisely because pilotage is a substitute to providing lighthouses, right? Lighthouses are a substitute to pilotage, right? So, for example, if lighthouses emit light on a river, less pilotage is necessary, right? So, what was the consequence of regulating and obtaining a monopoly privilege in pilotage? Trinity House restricted the establishment of, or attempted to restrict the establishment of lighthouses. They attempted to restrict its construction in order to protect its rents, hence rent seeking, right? What is rent seeking? It's the expenditure of time and effort to protect artificially created wealth or to prevent the transfer of artificially created wealth, right? the artificially created wealth is represented by this monopoly privilege in providing pilotage. But in order to secure this, its rent, it was also granted by Act of Parliament the exclusive right, the exclusive authority to erect sea marks. That is not only lighthouses, but also buoys and beacons during this time, right? However, lighthouses at this time could also come in the form of, for example, sheep herders, goat herders, emitting light on the top of their houses in the form of fires, right? So that's why I'm talking about sea marks more broadly. But what's interesting about the charter that was granted to them is that the word lighthouse doesn't appear. In the early 16th century, the word that was still used for lighthouse was a pharos, referring to the Pharos of Alexandria, right, which was a ancient lighthouse, right? Now, this picture that I show here, this was provided to a student of mine, where the modern Trinity House is still operating. Now, in that sign, which is hard to see here, it says that they are the establishers of the world's first modern lightship, which is untrue, and which I'll get to in a moment. Now, why is this all important? It's precisely because in the years between 1610 and 1675, Trinity House built no lighthouses. Right? They built no lighthouses. Now, because of this situation where Trinity House was not responsive to consumer demands for lighthouses, there were entrepreneurial profit opportunities that arose in order to provide lighthouses. Now, why did this happen? Right? Note one thing that I mentioned before. Trinity House, although a private organization, is nonprofit. In other words, it lacks residual claimancy in its decision-making. In other words, for Trinity House to establish lighthouses, that's a concentrated cost to the organization, but a dispersed benefit, right? In other words, given that Trinity House had no private owner, there was no beneficiary for the establishment of lighthouses. Any lighthouses that were established were a concentrated cost and a dispersed benefit. Why a concentrated cost? Because it presented a threat to its regulation of pilotage. So in other words, right, because Trinity House was a nonprofit organization, it did not bear the costs of potential shipwreck. In other words, going back to our discussion of the Austrian account of the market process, similar to what Mises had argued that economic calculation under central planning is impossible, Trinity House also faces a planner's problem. Unable to, right, outside the context, right, without profit and loss signals, they were unable to determine where and how to establish lighthouses. Right? So instead of learning how through profit and loss signals where and how to establish lighthouses, what did they learn instead? Given that they're operating a nonprofit setting, how did they learn to obtain profits? Through rent seeking. Right? Now, the fact that Trinity House barred or hampered and stifled the construction of lighthouses created a profit opportunity for two individuals named Sir William Erskine and John Maldron in 1624. Right? Given, right, that Trinity House's authority was granted by Act of Parliament, this created a profit opportunity that was both unintended and undesirable to Trinity House, which is that Erskine and Maldron lobbied the king directly for the provision of a patent, of a letters patent, of a medallion, similar to the taxicab medallion. Now, why is this important? The literature on lighthouses argues that the establishment of the letters patent was due to a market failure to prevent free riding, because lighthouses are a public good. Whereas in fact, the letters patent exemplifies a government failure. It arose as an unintended and undesirable consequence of regulations passed by the Act of Parliament that restricted the construction of lighthouses because Trinity House was attempting to protect its monopoly privilege in pilotage. Right? So the scarcity of lighthouses presented this profit opportunity to circumvent the regulatory authority of Trinity House. Right? Now, why is this important? Trinity, from the point of view of Trinity House, they're faced with either two choices, according to the dynamics of interventionism. They can either allow private lighthouse owners to establish lighthouses privately, but what would be the consequence of that? It would erode the rents of pilotage, of their monopoly on pilotage. Since they are unable, right, to produce lighthouses in a profitable manner, right, given that they're operating outside the market process, the only way that they can remain profitable and maintain the rents from pilotage is to lobby for an additional regulation. And that additional regulation came in 1679. The regulation was one in which Trinity House lobbied the king for the following arrangement, is that private entrepreneurs seeking to establish a lighthouse would have to go directly to Trinity House for authorization in the form of a letters patent. And then Trinity House, in turn, would petition the king for this letters patent. So rather than going directly through the king, as Erskine and Meldrum had done, they would go indirectly through the king, through Trinity House. In effect, what did Trinity House do? They utilized their regulatory authority to establish a context in which they controlled entry and exit in the construction of lighthouses, right? By controlling the number of letter patent, these taxicab medallions, that could be distributed in this market. Now, what was the consequence of this? Monopoly power. Monopoly power. By the early 19th century, it's estimated that 1/4 of the fees charged to ship owners were fees that went to collectors of fees, right? Because according to Coase, how were these lighthouses, how did the lighthouses exclude non-payers of lighthouse owners? Well, lighthouses were constructed near port. By constructing them near port, that implied that anyone utilizing the lighthouse could be excluded by being required to pay when they docked at port. But at port, individual agents of lighthouse owners, backed by government enforcement through the letters patent, collected these fees on behalf of owners of lighthouses. But this created monopoly pricing due to the fact that collection costs represented roughly 1/4 of the total charge paid by ship owners. Right? Now notice what I've set up here. There's a tremendous entrepreneurial profit opportunity due to these high prices to circumvent the existing regulation, right? Enter lightships. Now, a lightship is exactly what it sounds like. As I had referred to it, this is the Uber of the 18th century. A lighthouse is nothing, a lightship is nothing more than a floating lighthouse. It's a ship with a light that can provide, for example, lighthouse services where lighthouses can't be provided. So lighthouses are usually established at the coast of the Thames River. Instead, the beauty of light ships is that they could provide light where lighthouses could not be provided, specifically in risky areas, right? Areas where the Thames River was shallow. Now, what I'm talking about here is that in 1731, the world's first modern lightship was established in the Thames River by two entrepreneurs named David Avery and John Hablin. David Avery and John Hablin. Now, what's interesting about this is that they were not the first individuals to try to attempt to establish a lighthouse, a lightship. There were two other entrepreneurs previously who tried to establish lightships, named John Clayton and John Waggett in 1724. But Trinity House prevented the lightships from being established by denying their application for letters patent, right, to both John Waggett and John Clayton. Now, Avery and Ablin knew this. So, acting as private entrepreneurs, they realized a profit opportunity, right? They realized an entrepreneurial profit opportunity that others did not realize. Given that they were aware of the regulatory authority of Trinity House, what did they do, right? What did they do? Well, before I get to that, let me establish why the Norse lightship is so important, right? What makes this innovation so important? Now, this is a map of the area around London and the Thames River. Notice where I'm pointing the arrow here. That's the city of London in the 18th century. But notice how long the Thames River is, right? The Thames River, the area, right? The distance between London and the Thames River is well over 150 miles, right? Most of which is not navigable because it's too shallow, and especially during times of bad weather, is very prone to shipwreck, especially this area that I'm pointing to here. If you'll follow the arrow, this is where the world's first modern lightship was established, at the banks of the Thames River, called the Nore, right? The Nore was a shallow point of the Thames River, very susceptible to shipwreck. Very susceptible to shipwreck. Right? Now, here's what's very important about the story and why the lighthouse and lightships, which are floating lighthouses, is not demonstrative. It does not exemplify a public good, and why the story that's been told is wrong. It's precisely because Avery and Hablin, knowing that they would face opposition from Trinity House due to their fact that they were protecting their monopoly privilege over the conditions of entry and exit of lighthouses and control of pilotage, knew that if they lobbied for a letters patent, that they would be obstructed. So what was the profit opportunity that they seized? Right. This, what you'll notice here is an advertisement. This is a private advertisement by Hablin advertising the construction of the lightship. Right. Now, the only reason why you would advertise is that you would expect that you can privately finance the lighthouse. Now, here's what's important. The Nore lightship operated outside the Trinity House patent system. How did it operate it outside of it? The patent itself was for an invention, not for collecting light dues. Now, what do I mean by that? My co-author and I, Vincent Geloso, on this project that we've been working on, reading the primary documents, the documents from Trinity House, we read the original petition, which was applied for July 4th, 1730. And what Avery and Hablin argue is that we're not establishing a lighthouse here. What we're providing is a new technology to distinguish between lighthouses. So what they were arguing is that we're not providing a service that substitutes for the existing lighthouse system. We're providing a service that's going to complement it. Right? Given the situation, they realized a profit opportunity to circumvent the lighthouse system that was being regulated by Trinity House. Now, this is too important in two aspects of the story. One is, this was not a traditional patent, meaning it provided no government enforcement in the collection of fees. How did it, collect fees? It collects fees in three ways: through price discrimination, by charging different ships different prices according to their tonnage. This is what the advertisement illustrates. So that's one mechanism. The second mechanism was collection at port, which was provided without government enforcement. But here's the interesting innovation, one that got them busted by Trinity House. And this is the entrepreneurial profit opportunity that they seized. They were able to establish a new technology for excluding non-payers, a technology that Van Zandt argued didn't exist at the time, which is the same way that you pay for Netflix subscriptions, right? So this is prepayment, right? So what Avery and Hablin were saying, if you want us to invest in this lighthouse, if you want us to financing it, you've got to pay us up beforehand. Otherwise, we won't be able to establish it. Now, this had huge demand for colliers. Colliers are ship owners who transported coal from the east banks of London, from Birmingham, around the coast of London into the Thames River. Now, why do I say this is important? The lightship was established precisely at a time when shipping tonnage that was shipped in the southern coast of England increased by a factor of 5, from roughly 120,000 tons to 600,000 tons of shipping tonnage. Why is this important? Why is this important? The claim is, in economic theory, is that lighthouses are a public good precisely because they're non-rivalrous. However, the number of lighthouses was increasing during this time as tonnage was rising. What does that imply? An upward sloping supply curve, right? As it became more profitable to establish lighthouses, more lighthouses were established. So it's rivalrous, not non-rivalrous. But what's more important with respect to the patent system is that these prices were set by Avery and Hablin. In other words, they collected light dues voluntarily according to market prices, not prices fixed by the king. So they were able to collect these light dues privately without government enforcement and without a traditional patent that provided a rent to the king and to Trinity House. That implies they were able to undercut the existing lighthouse owners in the price that they charged, since they didn't require government agents for their collection. Recall what I said before. Roughly one quarter by the early 19th century of fees that were collected of the light dues were paid to agents of the king in collection. If you don't need agents of the king to collect this, you could eliminate that price. So they were able to provide a service at a lower price, as illustrated here. Here's some data, right, of competing lighthouses that were established at the time. Notice one thing: the Lightship was able to price out all their competition. Now, why is this important? Right? Why is this important? Once Trinity House got wind of this, right? Once Trinity House got wind of this, that they had lobbied for this petition, in the eyes of Trinity House, this is an entrepreneurial profit opportunity that is both unintended, unanticipated, and undesirable. Now, Trinity House is faced with two conclusions. They could either let the Lightship be established and compete directly against the regulated lighthouse market. But if they can't compete directly against them, what can they do? Lobby for a rent seek, which is exactly what they did. They lobbied the king, and they petitioned the crown in November 30th for revocation of their patent of invention, which was revoked in 1732. Now, Avery and Hablin were caught in a situation. They said, if we can't beat them, join them. So they had to settle with the government, right? And they had to settle by being granted a patent, right, in exchange for 100 pounds a year to the king. So in effect, they had to bribe the king in order to remain in operation. But here's where the story is very, very important. And then I will wrap up. The petition by Trinity House in November 30th states the following. It states that Avery and Hablin are not authorized to establish this lighthouse because it's their prerogative. That's the word they use, their prerogative for the collection of fees. Now, this is extremely important because for 200 years, almost 200 years, economists have been saying that the reason why lighthouses are unable to be established is because there's no private mechanism for collecting, for charging, for privately financing these lighthouses. But what this story illustrates is that not only was it possible, but its possibility was eliminated because of rent seeking. So, to conclude, right, lighthouses, lightships, which are floating houses, lighthouses, don't exemplify a public good. And that private provision of lightships was possible in spite of the fact that there was government regulation by Trinity House. Right? Even in the face of government opposition, there was a possibility, but it was snuffed out by rent seeking by Trinity House. Now, what are some important implications for public choice theory in particular? Right? For lighthouses and lightships, right, the degree of market failure has been overestimated. Right? So the degree to which lighthouses are exemplify a public good should not be the case. But more importantly, the degree of government failure has been underestimated. The degree to which government intervention has hampered the possibility for the private financing of lighthouses through entrepreneurial discovery illustrates that this is not that lighthouses are not a public good, and therefore the state is not required for its provision. It's exemplifying a government failure, right? A government failure that has created a situation that has eliminated the conditions for a market process to emerge, a market process in which entrepreneurs can discover private mechanisms for financing and establishing lighthouses. I thank you all very much for your attention, and Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosolino, for that conference. I gotta say, it was really, really interesting to see the unintended consequences and how entrepreneurs always adapt, to any regulation, to any new rule.
So now we're gonna,
yeah, right. So now we're gonna open the Q&A section. Si tienen alguna duda, alguna pregunta que le quieran hacer a Rosolino, levanten la mano y les doy la palabra, o pueden hacerlo por el chat. All right, so just in time before anyone asks anything, because I see they're shy today, I'm gonna ask you something.
Sure.
A couple of weeks ago, we were discussing a garden tulip paper. It was about rent seeking, right? And going through some ideas, we came to the conclusion that it is something that will always happen, that it's inevitable, that it goes from people voting on someone to pass a law, from people voting for someone to office to pass a law, to what we just talked about a big organization doing rent seeking their way into a monopoly. So do you think that this conclusion is right, that rent seeking is a part of life, inevitable?
I'm going to answer this question in the following way. Indirectly, so I'm discovering a profit opportunity to answer it indirectly. What do I mean by that? James, and I'll relate this to James Buchanan. Buchanan was famous for oftentimes quoting his teacher, Frank Knight. The following quote: "To call a situation hopeless is to call it ideal." Now, if you turn that quote on its head, what does that imply? A non-ideal situation is one for hope. That's the story of public choice. So what Buchanan was trying to argue is that, yes, rent seeking may be inevitable, right? It's an example of a non-ideal market, but this exemplifies the importance of rules that constrain discretion. Now, you might come back and say, Lionel, well, wait a minute, but that's why rent seeking is inevitable, because we don't have well-defined rules that constrain government policymakers, right? Now, here's where the problem gets even worse, right? Suppose, for example, let me just give an example. I'm answering your question, by the way, so it's going to sound like a digression and a tangency, but it's related to this point. I've told Luis this many times. I love Fanta. Fanta is my favorite soft drink, right? It's terrible in the US. Terrible, okay? Because the market price for sugar, the domestic price for sugar in the US is double of the world market price, because there's a sugar lobby, a domestic sugar lobby in the US that restricts foreign imports of sugar due to tariffs. Now, suppose, for example, tomorrow, right, President Trump wants to eliminate that. What would happen? Who has more power to maintain, right, this existing regulation, right? If you ask most people, they are not even going to know about the regulation, right? Like, for example, as pissed off as I am, I don't know how much more in sugar I spend each year. It's not worth my time, right? This is in public choice analysis, rational ignorance, right? But the individuals, the producers of sugar, they're very well informed. The elimination of this regulation would cost them millions of dollars. So they'll be sure to expend money under the threat that if this happens, that they will lobby for policymakers that will make sure that it will be eliminated. Now, why is this a problem? Because government intervention to eliminate rent seeking will only fuel more rent seeking, right? I'm going to use a weird analogy. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Fifth Element, where there's the evil that comes And this is a very bad example. But the military, they shoot missiles at evil. It's a fireball. What happens to the fireball? It gets even larger, right? So the point I'm making, the very source of rent-seeking government intervention can't be eliminated by additional government intervention to eliminate lobby groups, because it will only fuel additional rent-seeking and additional destruction of wealth. Now, why do I say this? Does this imply it's not inevitable? Is this inevitable? No, I don't think so. The reason why I don't think so is that this is why the power of ideas is so important, right? That what public choice analysis teaches us is that in order to correct particular inefficiencies due to government regulation, we can't use, right? We can't correct past inefficiencies because they may be very costly. Our focus should be directed on making sure that they don't happen. Because if additional regulations are not passed, if voters become more informed about these unintended consequences, there will be profit opportunities to erode, right, the rents that exist with regulation. Right. Kerzner illustrated that if there's a profit opportunity, entrepreneurs will seize it. Right. Let's go back to the taxi cab medallion issue. Right. The fact that it's very, very expensive to get a taxi in New York City, both in time and money, presented that profit opportunity for Uber, right, to come in. Right. I'm sure that there have been many monopolies that have existed in the past in Guatemala that have been eroded by entrepreneurs. Right. So what this illustrates is that so long as that there are future deformities, future interventions are not introduced, past inefficiencies can be eliminated from government intervention through through the power of entrepreneurship. I know that that's not a satisfactory answer, but my point is that I have such hope that because government regulators are not residual claimants, that because they operate outside the market process, they can never adapt as quickly as entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs will always be one step ahead of them. But I think it's incumbent on us as defenders of liberty to hold the line, because if government regulation, if it can be rolled back, if it can at least be slowed down, I guarantee you entrepreneurs will step up and adapt to the situation to erode the inefficiencies of regulation. I'm sorry, it's a very long-winded answer.
There's another question by Juan Daniel Alfaro. He's saying, how can we start letting people know about these kind of things like rent seeking in a country where there is some sort of romantic view about the state fixing our problems and stepping in to fix our lives?
Oh, if we had an answer to that question, then the problem would be solved. I mean, I think the most important, again, the most important thing is well, let me put it to you this way. There are some economists like Mansur Olson who have argued that things have to get really bad before they become really, really good. But again, I don't think the issue change is going to come from the inside by policymakers that themselves. It's going to come from people like Juan, who just raised this question, who are communicating these ideas, whether it's through social media, through print media, right, through articles, and so on and so forth. It's not going to happen overnight. Right? It's going to be a very, very gradual change. Right? I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but if I had that answer, if anyone had that answer, then the problem would be eliminated.
Yeah. So we have two people with their hands up. First is going to be Elba Gomez, and then after her, it's going to be Carmen Valdez. So, Elba, you can activate your microphone.
Hello, good night, Rosolino. I wanted to ask you a question. It will be like the question of Juan Daniel Alfaro, but a little bit different. Is that in Latin America, we have like this romantic view, as Juan Daniel says, about the state being the savior of everyone. But later, we had a discussion in university like 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about that sometimes the state has to intervene in cases when the market is no longer profitable. I mean, for example, people that it's not handicapped people, that this kind of cases. I mean, sometimes it's not always profitable for the private sector to do this kind of activities, right? So by the public choice perspective, we have seen that it's not always like the state has to be all the time outside. So can we give like not like in the public choice perspective, but can we be a little bit like intermediate in these cases when the state because I think that if it's no longer profitable for the industry to help handicap, we cannot leave people like alone over there. So maybe we can do something like hybrid. What do you think about that?
So if I understand your question correctly, I'm going to rephrase it so that I understand, but please tell me if I'm rephrasing it the correct way, is that there are situations in which the market process cannot provide adequate services to the disadvantaged, to individuals who are otherwise disadvantaged, whether they're handicapped, they're poor, or they have some other type of disadvantage. Am I correct in rephrasing it that way?
Yeah. But I meant like when in the private sector is no longer profitable. Like we can fulfill that necessity, but it's no longer profitable anymore. So the private sector leaves that over there. So the state has to intervene in that case.
Well, in order to answer this question, I'm going to refer to you there. I highly recommend you read the work of an Austrian. He's actually he's not as well known as he should be well known, but he's one of Mises's early students named Richard Cornell. And what Richard Cornell talked about is that there's a third sector of the economy. So we usually think of the economy as being divided up as the public sector, those goods and services provided by government, and then the market sector. But he said there's a third sector that's just as important, which is the independent sector. That is the sector of voluntary association amongst groups of individuals, right? Kind of like what Tocqueville in Democracy of America talked about, that there's a scope for voluntary association that's not organized around profits and losses. To take an example, Trinity House, prior to what was Trinity House's focus beforehand, before it granted this monopoly privilege? It provided a private social safety net for the widowers and orphans of mariners, right? So there's a scope within a market economy, not by markets exactly, but the market economy. For example, the role of churches, the role of clubs, the role of mutual aid societies that provide these things, right? Which are not organized. They're not organized around profit, but they are compatible and emerge through the market. Does this make sense? Or
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
So just to put this another way, is that one thing we have to take into account is the role that going back to what I had said before we rule out a market failure in, for example, providing help to the handicapped, to the poor, to the disadvantaged, we have to first ask ourselves, what are government interventions that are crowding that out, or potentially crowding that out? Right.
Thank you. So now we have our last question. Carmen, you can turn on your microphone.
Thank you. Hi, Rosolino.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. I liked very much your presentation. It was super interesting.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I think my question is slightly related with Elba's question. Some weeks ago, we were talking about in the club, we were talking about licenses in some industries. And well, I was wondering if you think it is reasonable for some industries to like require this, like for the government to ask this requisite, even if it means like some kind of rent seeking because of the nature of the industry, like for example, the healthcare industry, because I think it also has like a moral and ethical character for the well-being of the people that's gonna be like treated by these people in these industries.
Let me answer. I'm going to answer that question by asking you a question so that you answer it yourself. Have you gone to the doctor's office lately? In recent? Okay. Where's your doctor from? Excuse me. Where's your doctor's medical degree from?
I think Navarra's University.
Okay. Have you seen the license before? Have you actually seen the license? Have you asked for it? You haven't seen the license?
No.
What's wrong with you? Aren't you afraid that he's going to do something to you?
Well, no, because someone recommended him.
So what does that imply?
That, well, the market actually takes care of it.
No. I'm not being snarky. I'm trying to reveal a very important point. What is the claim that licensing does? It provides information about consumers to consumers so that they're consuming a good safely, correct?
Yeah.
But if you ask 99% of people who, let's say, go to a doctor who's licensed, how many of them have actually asked for the license, but instead actually went to the doctor because someone recommended to them by word of mouth? So markets provide alternate forms of information that are different from licensing. So, right now, here's another question I would suggest. How many of the things that you go to your doctor could be done by a nurse practitioner?
Well, I don't know, because I went like to a neuro. It's not a neurosurgeon, but it's a neuro doctor, So it's more specific.
Okay, but in the case of, for example, you were sick because you had a cough or a cold. How many of those things could be provided by the nurse or someone else who doesn't have a doctorate degree?
Well, I think many of them.
Yeah, probably a good deal of them, right? So now I'm not saying, what am I trying to say? What I'm saying is that I'm going to talk out of two sides of my mouth. If you ask me up front, I don't see a role for licensing at all. Okay. Now, that doesn't imply that there are other possibilities that government could provide. For example, certification. What does certification do? It's a piece of paper that states that you've gone through a series of courses or you've done some sort of training. But it doesn't bar someone without certification to go into that market. It's a form of providing information to a consumer. That's an alternative way of providing information. The question is then, if that's true, why is it that more markets don't just require certification, right? Because I, as a consumer, I can make that choice. I can go, let's say if I want to go to a barber in New York City, you have to have a license. No one has ever asked my dad. My dad's been a barber for 48 years. Not one person I asked him has asked him for his license. Not one. To see if they were going to provide his service in a safe manner. Not one.
Mhm.
So what does that imply? It implies that the only reason it exists, it must exist, is to protect the profitability of the existing providers of that good.
Mhm.
If all these other mechanisms of providing information exist. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was a really interesting question, and the way you answered it, it was really interesting too. So I think we have time for one more question. If anyone has a question, I'll give 30 seconds. All right, so we have one more question from Jose Navas. Given that rent seeking looks like it is inevitable, and when laws that try to get rid of it actually make it grow, does this mean that we're condemned to having rent seeking, or only private initiative could solve it with innovation?
So going back, so this is very similar. I'm going to answer this question differently from the initial question that was asked, because it is a different question. It's asking it's addressing the problem of rent seeking and its inevitability in a different way. And in a way I think that's important, is although rent seeking may be inevitable, what's most important is that private productive entrepreneurship is always able to outpace, right, rent seeking itself. And again, the reason why I have faith that even as rent seeking grows, right, economic growth will still exist, is precisely because entrepreneurs in the private market process, they have one weapon on their side that rent seekers and policymakers don't have, which is profit opportunities. Right. So given the fact, right, what do I mean by that? Rent seeking has opportunity cost. If I am a rent seeker, every minute, every dollar, every resource I expend, rent seeking is one less dollar or resource or additional unit of talent that I have directed towards acting in a productive manner, right? So there are opportunity costs to rent seeking. But more importantly, right, given the fact that entrepreneurs, right, have profit and loss incentives on their side, right, I argue that they are able to outpace it. Now, there's only so much rent seeking an economy can take before it can get crushed. There's no question about it. But again, the market, what the entrepreneurial market process illustrates is that it's much more robust and much more hardy, in spite of the fact that, right, rent seeking still continues to exist, right? Still continues to exist. Now, it's very lucky. I'm very fortunate to say that, because I was born and raised in the United States. So it's very easy for me to say that, very easy. But here's what's interesting. If you look around the world today, as of 2015, this made headline news that as of 2015, less than 10% of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. The history, right? That's from the World Bank. It's not from some libertarian or some right-wing capitalist organization. It's from the World Bank, that data. Now, why do I say that? The history of mankind is rent-seeking. But yet, in the 19th century, beginning in Northwestern Europe and spreading around the world, there has been this explosion of economic growth in spite of the fact that rent-seeking has existed. Rent-seeking has always existed. It's the story of mankind, right? I'll conclude. How much time do we have, Lionel?
Approximately four more minutes. Yeah.
In order to think about this, there have been three ways, right? There are essentially three ways that people have been able to obtain resources, right? For example, Lionel, I could bash you over the head and take your goods, that's theft. Or I can hire Luis to take those resources from you and direct it to me. That's public predation. That's the role of government regulation, right? Transferring, for example, wealth from one party to another. But then there's a third way of competition that's productive. We can specialize and we can trade. All those three things have existed, but the history of mankind up until the 18th century has been predominated by rent-seeking. It's only in these last 300 years, 250 years, right? Which is a huge, it's an exception to the history of humankind, a huge exception. So the question is not, the puzzle is not, is rent-seeking inevitable? Of course it is. The real puzzle is, how were we able to innovate around it? That's the true question of economics, right? That's the fundamental puzzle, not whether it's inevitable, but how we were able to get around it and live with it. Sorry, I don't mean to avoid the answer, but I think that's what we should be focusing in on.
Okay, thank you, Rosolino, for all your answers. I know there will be people with more questions, but because of the time, we have to end the conference right now. But maybe after my presentation, people could stay and ask some questions. But in the name of the Public Choice Club, we thank you for your amazing conference. It gave us a lot of value. I think we can discuss a lot of things, and we hope to see in other activities of the club, and someday maybe at the university halls. But we thank you.
I hope to be back once this stuff goes down. I hope to be back on campus.
That will be awesome. Yeah,
I miss it. I miss being on campus, and I want to get Fanta while I'm there too. It's good. And Zacapa and Fanta.
Yeah. But Rosalie, can you please stop sharing your screen? I want to share something.
Of course.
Yeah,
absolutely.
No, it's okay. Thank you. So just some announcements, but para este mes de noviembre, de parte del club vamos a tratar el tema del mes es Homunculus Politicus. Básicamente vamos a como la misma metodología del mes pasado, vamos a tener papers de Buchanan y Tulloch y cineforos. También vamos a cerrar con una conferencia, pero esperamos que nos puedan acompañar en las discusiones, en las lecturas de paper y en el cineforo, porque realmente ni siquiera es necesario leer, solo participar y poder discutir. Yo creo que aportamos bastante valor y podemos aprender mucho. Entonces, los esperamos para que se registren en el club y los esperamos en las siguientes actividades.